Welcome to Semantics in Conversation. This week we'll be talking about poetry. At the World Ayahuasca Conference back in 2019, the Chilean educator Claudio Naranjo, he gave his last ever talk. He died a few weeks later. And his closing statement was this, so the last words of his last ever talk were this. He said, "Creo que el mundo psicodélico está cayendo en el mismo pecado de la arrogancia de la ciencia, una superstición que la ciencia sabe más que la poesía y los mitos. I believe that the psychedelic world is falling into the same trap of arrogance that science has, believing that science is wiser than poetry or mythology." And this got a standing ovation from over 1,000 people. It was so moving. And it gets to the heart of something that we kind of mention quite frequently in these sessions, which is that the danger of too much certainty, of being too attached to the idea that there's an objective reality or any singular truth. I like to think of poetry, along with psychedelics, as something that can really work well as an antidote to dogma, a way to encourage the left hemisphere to simmer down, if we use McGilchrist's metaphor, who also describes poetry really nicely. He describes it as a speaking silence, as having the capacity to express a world characterized by betweenness. And McGilchrist, he's one of the rare examples of a medical professional who really incorporates poetry into his science and philosophy, and not just in a tokenistic way. He was originally a scholar of literature, and he ended up writing a book. His first book was on the paradoxicality of analyzing literature, of taking a sort of unique, embodied piece of art and framing it through a load of theoretical abstractions and generalizations, which to some extent undercuts anything I might say next in terms of an introduction to the thing we call poetry. But for me, at least, poetry is something that is particularly embodied. In my case, I have to read poetry out loud. I can barely follow them, and I certainly don't feel them otherwise. So for me, the word poetic, it's like any use of language where language goes beyond itself, where paradox is permitted and where ambiguity is actually applauded. The process of meaning making, it's allowed to be a lot more participatory than it might be in normal prose, which I think is really key to appreciating that the connection between poetry and mysticism or sort of spiritual practice. Zen might be the most famous example for those techniques, but it's certainly not exclusive to Eastern language practices. William James, wrote about whispering silences and dazzling obscurities. These types of paradoxes that appear in Western mystical literature. Though it seems to be something that may have diminished, and I suspect a few lives might have been spared if everybody read the Bible as a poetic work. And there's strong evidence that it used to be more participatory. Apparently the scriptures written in ancient Hebrew were far more ambiguous than their modern counterparts. The alphabet had no letters for what we've come to call vowels. So basically reading ancient Hebrew required a lot more contextual inference. And apparently all the ancient Semitic languages shared this structure, written words and phrases and stories, they're conspicuously incomplete. That there's a similar kind of effect in Chinese singing, actually, and I suspect all tonal languages, whereby the demands of pitch means that the tones are mostly ignored. Basically, if you were a priest 3,000 years ago, then interpretation was a much larger part of your job and your study than it might be now, or any time after vowels were kind of let loose on written language. So it immediately sort of shrinks the multiplicity of meaning. It restricts meaning enough to embalm many aspects of sort of mystical texts into creeds. But for me, this is what poetry can allow, this expansion into a really rich uncertainty. I always think that dogma resists ambiguity and ambiguity sort of resists dogma. A lot of sort of healing ceremonies and practices in the indigenous world, they use this sort of linguistic ambiguity. And, it's really not about resolving contradictions for people. There's a real power in withholding meaning. And that's often part of the so-called shamanic performance. Some ikaros, the magic songs, they're really impenetrable by design, which seems like a good place to bring in our very special guest today, our great friend, Juhan Constable, author, bard, playwright, performer, songwriter, esoteric tour guide, owner of many great jackets, or perhaps just one. It's a really, really great jacket. And I met Juhan on a sort of retreat for lunatics about 5 years ago, and he is just remarkable. Juhan has this way about him where just his presence makes you feel like you've arrived home. We're just really elated to have you. And it's probably best known in our circles for the Southern Mysteries, an epic series of poems dictated to his alter ego, John Crow, by the Goose, who was a sort of medieval sex worker. This was back in 1996.
It began on 23rd November 1996, and it was published in 1999. So it was a completely millennial work in that sense.
Yes. And for 26 years, there was a vigil held at Crossbones Graveyard on the 23rd of every month to honour the outcasts.
Yeah, every 23rd at 7:00. Others are doing it now, but it's great that it keeps going.
Yes, a few years ago, I was also sort of researching parapsychology and entities for my PhD, and I wrote to Juhan about the Goose, the character who dictated these poems, about whether he attributes autonomous existence to her. And the grace of your response, Juhan, was so illuminating. You said, over the past 23 plus years, I've entertained many interpretations of the Goose. At one extreme, that she's an autonomous part of my own psyche. At the other, that she already existed and intervened from the astral using my own psychic architecture to reveal and delineate herself more clearly. In the end, I reconciled these contraries in a both and neither. I just loved that. That's in my PhD, by the way. That's a footnote in my PhD.
Delighted to hear it.
And yes, I believe John's going to read a little bit of this work and a little bit from his new book, Grail, which charts more magical adventures with the Goose in Glastonbury. Alongside, who have we got now? Ros, Dolly, and Pascal.
Shall we go then? Shall we fly?
Let's fly.
Okay, so thank you, Reanne, for that lovely introduction. Even your general comments at the beginning, I completely endorse, really, and I think that guides the work I'm trying to do very much, and specifically the sense that poetry is the contrary of dogma, and that it does always point beyond itself. So anything I can say about the Goose and her relationship with John Crow is kind of only emblematic. But the thing with these poems, I've always tried to write to access something beyond myself in writing. But what happened with the Southern Mysteries was the mediation of the Goose, a sort of seemingly fully formed muse with her own backstory and her own conditions, really, for how it was going to be delivered. So it was this dance she did with John Crow that produced this first book, the Book of the Goose, which was the first of 7 books of the Southern Mysteries. And in each of the books, she's kind of shape-shifting, particularly between this idea of the sacred and the profane, the spirit in the flesh, eternity in time. That is the play, I think, of the Goose throughout the whole work. And so I'm going to do just a very short part from the middle of the Book of the Goose. And it kind of demonstrates this sense of healing the rift between the flesh and the spirit. So this is from the Book of the Goose. Yes, I've been here before, dear. Oft times in chastened circumstance. I lay with Master Geoffrey at the Tabard, making dalliance before wending on his pilgrimage to tell a tale of Canterbury. And I rode out beside him as the child of Mary Overy went riding for a vision of humanity, man, God, and beast, communing for one moment in eternity, and the healing of the sick and the questioning divinity who asks herself, what am I, to permit such wanton misery and compassion for all souls that dwell in shadows of mortality, compelling her to take on very flesh of that infirmity until she's born a crafty whore, stewed in a Southwark hostelry, and using all her wherewithal to take a pilgrim's fancy and play with him and lay with him and open eyes to see the goddess that on judgment day shall stand by man and make his plea. And I was in that miller's wife who pushed her tush at Absalom, who kissed he many a wench's lip, but nary such a hairy one. You don't know me yet, dear. You will, dear, I promise you. I am a tricksy tart, dear. My aim is to astonish you. Down, we, ministry of sound, where we tribal dances, dear. What comes from underground isn't subject to the rule of fear. It must have given you a start to find me so lysergic, dear. When it comes to stealing hearts and healing rifts between our hemispheres, there's no trick I wouldn't pull to entice you over here.
Thanks for that, John. So beautiful to hear that again. And yeah, thanks for having me, Reanne and Ros as well. And yeah, I just want to echo that I really resonated with what you were saying as well, regarding poetry and its possibility as a language form that constantly kind of juxtaposes itself and offers lots of kind of bendy, flexible, kind of veiled and unveiled, misty places of meaning. That's a lot of what my sort of mission is with poetry as well, and has been probably since before I had some of the other scaffolds I've got for that now, misty scaffolds. Okay, but I'm going to read this, which is from this year, from May this year, and seems relevant. Beltane Dream Dance. Weave spacious silver threads, lake lapping, deep time maiden. Nature is such a limited construction, this vast humming presence, life force, evolving, endless form. So learn to hold a million billion truths at once, in gorgeous, gentle tension. If they seem to contradict each other, that's okay. Some realities which coexist and are the same thing, a Rapunzel structure of new eukaryotic life, are not meant to be grasped, yet, by human consciousness. We carry some code, much larger intelligence, zoom out or in, perceive and feel. You may find you can test for its presence. Observe yourself noticing. What do you feel inside your fingers? Listen. Our child is learning how to speak, awakening on a precipice, camped out in many realities. If they seem to contradict each other, perhaps that's okay. Many different, same mirrors, karmic groups, diverse, judgment may fall, yet it seems on one mission, which is you, child, through many eyes. Dreaming you was not blind faith, nor a cold, calculated experiment. We vibrated and wove, we stumbled for weeks, months, lifetimes. As our intentions, the lands, the myths, the flows and tensions came together, down and out, up in dance, one moment in and out of time, spinning wheel, electricity point, of light, of love in motion. Wind blows me away. Thanks.
That was gorgeous. Yeah, really wonderful to be here because I've heard a lot about the semantic stuff and spoken to Reanne and Ros about it a lot, and watched Maya's amazing. So really cool to just be part of it in a little way. I did have lots of thoughts, from the beginning, what you were saying, Reanne, about, like when you mentioned William James talking about the whispering silence as similar to the speaking silence, and reminded me of the dazzling dark, which was what particularly near-death experience had described his void, this kind of like shimmering void experience, like the encounter with God, but that was itself based on a poem, actually. And it's unfortunate that since that is the topic of everything, I've actually forgotten the poet and the poem at this moment. I really loved what you said. One of your lines, Dolly, was so amazing. The what was it? The Rapunzel structure of new eukaryotic lives or realities, or was it? It was beautiful. And John, when one of your lines as well, especially spoke to me when you said, "There is no trick I won't pull in order for you to come to this side," as well. That really, really, really struck me as well. Okay, I'll get to the poem. Iotoscopic wormholes adorn the grand plan, everywhere masked. A magnetic network, beautifully insidious. They chatter and conspire. They sweep minds, God-wielded scythes, tirelessly reconfiguring the chaos game of arcing legs, floating thoughts, of aggregated, stylized molecules. And he observes himself in the belly of a bulging circus tent, a mere fool, a freak just enjoying the fruits of his nature, where tidal wave songs channel through crowds, carve through canals in ears, wet and wiry webs in surging heads, and flower into petals, peeling out to penetrate every mental orifice. Then is eternity looking him dead in the eye. Spinning melodies wash through schools of faces, spheres of light detonate in undying loops. The cosmic garden is blooming to the right beat. It blooms to the only rhythm. All objects fall in grace into rightful coordinates. All words nestle into divine syntax. The engine abhors mortality. It so loves the world. It had sacrificed death, its own beloved blood, to imbibe oblivion, to soak in the abyss stirred by that chalice, so that now life will linger as the pure law. Compassion ineffable bellows as it whispers, "You are cherished evermore." Yet he starts to notice stars draining, dragging into pirouetting deep black upon scaling screams monolithic. The music whines as gravity contorts, screeching across the yawning Akashic disc. All universal pain needled onto his bleeding brain. See it all sink into pinpoint naught. The everything is grinding to a halt. The band no longer marched its Marvel march. Conductor dropped his wands. The most fleeting quiver of the young boy's heart. For a half-existent instant, a glitch had deluded this domain, convinced even itself of its inevitable freezing to a static pixel, until the unspeakable. An honor he stands to bear witness to globes emerging from dust, Golden swellings of boiling light melt through wallpaper void, shimmering tape reel. Spokes of yellow, simmering jets strive from their bulbs. Like yearning arms, they stroke the heavens, one by one. Like sundials, they are the keys of time, celestial instruments of sublime light. Like watermills, creeping peacefully in ever-perpetual cycles, drinking from the source. Like orbiting streams, irrigating the cool clay, innovating in omnipresence. These are the eyes of God. This is the sun of all the universe winking at the core. And they are lost in human eyes now. His earthly eyeballs, mirrors ensnaring that one which was always and is for all time. That one forever encoiled in a pool of universes of infinity. His flesh is so constructed from love. It is love's embodiment, the very face, the generator. This being has forsaken any other odyssey of soul. It is lifeless, yet life's own breath, self-suspended in the dark seams between realms, that life should forever enjoy living now and forever. For it breathed the cosmos into its first movement, birthed it into dawning twilight, and in the end, all of existence simply had to exist, for otherwise there would be no love.
Wow, that was absolutely beautiful, and the magnitude of the imagery all brought together to create something that felt like such a symphony of different, very, very epic, beautiful feeling thoughts. I love the chalice and kind of the fairy tale iconography that runs through parts of it. I think the phrase that I loved the most was the forever encoiled in a pool of universes, because I feel like that encapsulates so much of the expansiveness that both Dolly and John have kind of talked about, the idea of trying to find something to hang the wording on. But I feel like there's an encapsulation of so much infiniteness in many of the phrases there. I love the thematically that both you and Dolly, John talked about kind of psychic architecture and scaffolding, and this idea that we need to find the words to hang the thoughts on so that we can have some kind of emblematic ability to convey something that is bigger and has these multiplicities of meaning that come out around what we actually manage to say in a poem. And so the one I'm going to read, it actually has a burning scaffold in it, and it is about the transition between one psychic headspace and the next. It's the last poem I wrote that I feel I wrote with a sense that it might be readable out loud or performable, because for me, poetry used to be something that I did very much as a processing tool rather than something that was necessarily going to be wrought into something that would be sayable or performable or come out into the world. But this is one of the first ones I wrote that has a bit of a rhythm and had kind of tendrils of spoken wordiness rather than notebook scribbliness to it. So it's called Loving Awareness. The words used to slither out like stitches, silked in the creases of the sides of iPhone notes, between the tube stops, threaded each with their own flavour, salted caramel secretions, pockets. The words to love songs never sung, spooled freely in the dark in rivulets and off a cliff, notes skipping beats and into years discreetly, thrumming unsung and unheard in the darker padlocked pockets, while the life force pulled downwards the bloodstains of my cloak. Not All vampires hate garlic, and the hummus that they bring you masks the marks they always didn't mean to make. But when lashings of tahini come so few and far between, me and the careful nests I kept alive with words began to break. Then the lashings in between the arid weeks with no tahini smart like whiplash on the backbone of a promise as it broke. And the blood, it still ran downwards from the teeth marks in my thorax, till it hardened ever darker in the lining of my cloak. But the tower, as it crumbles, churns its life force from the rubble, and the eye of Horus twinkles as it catches on a spoke. And the wheels, they keep turning, they're about regeneration, and the scaffolding you draped your dreams on's just gone up in smoke. You see, through all the fog lamps, to the shadows that they're casting, at the edges of the forest where you're yet to drag your cloak. In the soft inviting soil gleaming silver in the darkness, paw prints shimmer by my footsteps, lupine talismans call inwards like they want to share a joke. Woodland journeys come with warnings. Little big girls will be eaten. If we scamper off the pathway, there's a moral to invoke. But the morals that we munch on in the byways where they bring us lead to stories ripe for living, in a language yet unwrote. And my claws fix in the paw prints as I find them all to mesh with in the beauty of the darkness, where I dare to drop my cloak. There's a deeper kind of knowing when you're shooting stars at questions, and the answers you discover flare the whiskers of a wolf. In the full beams of the moonlight, you can taste him in your howling, and the wood becomes your heartbeat as your paw prints dapple brightly in the mud you're freshly marking as you make each other out. Then, the wood smoke comes from fire as the hearth throbs lycanthropic, and desire whirs and trembles between every thrash and stroke. And the woodcutter stays home because he senses a new story, and unhewn by silver axe, moon streaks the branches of this oak. Above it, stars can do the talking, and when Aries conjunct Aries, twin fire signs inflame each other, and there's fuego for the smoke. When a werewolf meets a redcap, and the redcap bites the werewolf, we'll find all the secrets sparkling in the belly of the book.
That was a wonderful experience. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you all about sort of what function poetry plays in your life.
I said quite recently, and I rejoice in this, that I work at a kind of interface of poetry, theatre and magic. And that's how it's worked out in my life, through having worked a lot in the theatre, having always loved poetry, and seen it, I think, as a way, in different points of my journey, I've seen it differently, but there was always a relationship with magic. So a way of accessing altered states and a way of trying to give expression to them. I think that's what I particularly have tried to do in the Southwark Mysteries and Grail, is to write what I would playfully but seriously call psychoactive poetry. And that is the idea that, especially you spoke of reading aloud, because I think that's very important to me. When poems are spoken aloud, especially with certain rhythms, I think they're very close to spells, in the sense of magic spells. And they can be, I try to write good spells, not to curse or covet my neighbor, because I think that's important, because I think words have agency of their own. And there is a realm of ideas, however one calls that, a noosphere or the astral, where these things have effect. And so for me, it is a kind of holy vocation without getting too precious about it. It's also great fun. It's a good thing to follow as an outsider. I mean, the idea that you really ever earn a living from it. I earned a living of sorts as a writer and performer, but not really as a poet. People get the poetry for free, mostly.
How would you characterize the difference between spells and poems?
Well, I would say every poem, in some sense, or most good poetry is in some sense a spell, an enchantment. It creates a world inside your mind that isn't, it may be a world that reflects the outer world, or it may reflect another world. And poetry can do both. I think poetry can also accommodate, the great thing of poetry, which you have talked about, it can accommodate contrary ideas. The Goose's Liberty is a place where opposite ideas can do a dance without killing each other. I think this is, to me, what poetry has. Spells is a big topic, of course, because a lot of the casting of spells should be classed really as forms of abuse and psychic rape. But then there are spells that are cast, where you would wish for others what you would wish for yourself in the broadest sense, remembering we're all different. I think those kind of spells are what poetry can do at its best, because it doesn't, and that's the difference. There's a whole class of dark spells that seek to bind the recipient. I would say poetry seeks to liberate the hearer.
That's lovely. Thank you, John. Do any of the others want to talk about the role that poetry plays in your life?
And I resonate with a lot of what John said in terms of the more sort of big relation to reality stuff. I think for me, poetry has always been really useful as a form of language that gives access to those kind of essential contradictions that one encounters without trying to be right about one way or the other, and where you can also kind of play out, I quite like using poems to play out sides of how things appear and to seem quite certain within them sometimes, but that doesn't actually have to mean a certainty, and then maybe in the next line it's certain about something else, or it's addressing a different subject in a different way. I really like its kind of flexibility in those kind of ways that I feel that kind of common speech and prose, you can do that, but it's always a little bit clunkier and trickier. I've always written poetry, and I kind of came to terms with the idea that I was actually a poet probably about 7 or 8 years ago now. So I've been doing it for a little while, and I do think this actually says something about the role poetry plays in my life, and a kind of a thing about being a poet perhaps as well, in a more general sense. It was finding a kind of poetry community that, while I didn't completely resonate with, I could find some people to be able to kind of bounce poems off each other, to be able to discuss our work, that kind of thing, and being taken kind of seriously by them. I'd had friends who were poets before that I'd done that with, but I think our ways of writing poetry had been quite different. There'd been kind of performance poets and things like that, mostly, who were much more straight down the line with it, I guess, and kind of doing it. It's almost more like sort of observational comedy or something, although it doesn't have to be funny, that kind of thing, which is great too, of course. But I think it was finding people who were really interested in poetry's ability to kind of explore meaning and the meanings of words, and kind of explode that sometimes and just do different things with it, and being taken seriously by some of those people, I think, was the thing that changed. The
sort of cosmic poets.
Partly, but also some of them, they are kind of all are in their own different ways, but I think they would definitely, whether they would all class themselves that way, I don't know. They're not necessarily but that's an interesting thing too. I like how there can be poetries that aren't kind of directly speaking about magic or about other worlds or about psychedelics or what have you, that still do a lot of the same work. That's something that really interests me, and I'm glad of that. I used to use, I have gone through phases, perhaps is a better way of putting it, of using poetry a lot to explore kind of psychedelic experiences and states and things like that as well, and to kind of use that way that poetry can be a bit more slippy and misty in that way, to be able to do that. I feel like sometimes now perhaps I'm using it more as an interface of the kind of I don't know, yeah, other ways of feeling and experiencing things, the kind of somatic world and the energetic world, and language, and an attempt at an interface anyway.
Yeah, I find it's particularly helpful when I realized that nature was alive and not just a load of stuff. Going back to Wordsworth and, you know, this sort of those like romantic poets, and then actually like those lines staying in my mind from particular poems, like particularly Blake and Wordsworth, which made me remember that nature is alive.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's other people's poems too, and also one's own poetry can definitely be this as well, because it's a way of at least writing some kind of a pointer to these things more effectively than perhaps conversational language or prose might be. It can be a good reminder in that way. Yeah, definitely.
I really liked what you said about how there are some poems that aren't necessarily overtly about drugs or altered states of consciousness, maybe do many of the main things. Because I think when I think about poetry and drugs, I feel like there are many poems that are about drugs or about kind of trying to conceptualize an altered state of consciousness, but then there are many poems that were maybe just written on a substance, or maybe where the taking of a substance was inspirational to the way that the language ended up being cut up and arranged, but where you don't necessarily get the drugs shining through into the poem. I think particularly when I think about Allen Ginsberg, I feel like the Wales Visitation is actually nowhere near as trippy as something like Sunflower Sutra or America, where there's so much more kind of dissolving and blending between different images in the language. And Wales Visitation is kind of like a brilliant PR piece for LSD, and the fact that he's known to have written it on LSD and kind of always introduces it that way makes it a drugs poem. But I think my conceptualization of a drugs poem definitely, I feel like a lot of what you said resonates with where many poems can contain altered state elements but not necessarily be about the drugs that they were written on or that inspired them.
I think it's the struggle to express the ineffable that is the contradiction at the heart of poetry, and it's a beautiful creative contradiction. You know, this sense that you're not using words to pin things down on your map. Really, they are much more as words like fluid and slippy have been used. With your permission, could I read you a poem from Grail?
Of course.
They're very short, my poems. I might even sneak in two. But I particularly thought of this when Ros was speaking there about what is a drug poem. The piece I did earlier from the Book of the Goose was written under a massive dose of LSD, so it was an exception. This I didn't write under the influence, although I would say it bears the influence. And I've found this over the last 25 years, as I've grown older, that it does become, I think my poetry has gone somewhere different in that sense. It's still seeking to evoke, I suppose, a state of connectedness. And I sometimes tag myself as a street bard. And I do see myself in that bardic tradition, which was transmitting ancient knowledge, but in the language of the time. And so this is a poem dedicated to Taliesin, who's like the archetypal 6th century bard, may have really existed or may have been a composite, but kind of top bard. And there's two references in it that some of you will know. One is to his poem, The Spoils of Anun, where he travels with Arthur to launch a raid on the other world in order to gain the cauldron of inspiration. And in another poem, he speaks of claiming his chair in Caercydi, which was the Welsh connection. Ros talking about Wales, because this is a Welsh psychedelic poem and a kind of, not an answer to Ginsberg, but Hail Taliesin. Perfect is my chair in Caercydi. in the revolving castle, whose doors open not in the fixed, mapped, X-marked spots, but in the cracks, the quirks and quarks that shift their shapes to quake the castle walls. If I had to tell it to the scientist, I'd say the castle doors are chemical receptors you key in with a twist. When you're in, you're it. Be still in the spin of the whirligig castle, cross-eyed to see the lip in the skin and key in. Next twist, if you fix on anything, you get fixed. Be nothing. At the hub of the turning castle, see what you shall see and return in poetry. In the living heart of the spiral castle, I drink from the cauldron, warmed by the breath of 9 muses. And what I drink, I am. I am sky. I'm raven who fly me, a chuckle of sparrows, the waxing moon and the sun who seed them. And knowing that castle door is always open, not on some fabled island in the west, but close as breath and heartbeat, as hand on moss and stone in the fairy castle. I am. Perfect is my chair in Kaya City. So that's an attempt to talk about maybe the whole poetic process, sort of honoring an archetypal bard. And because these poems are very short, may I just do one more, very quick one every time?
Of course.
I'm so.
Because these new poems, and it does illustrate a bit when I'm talking about spells. The first 3 poems I wrote in Glastonbury, the first 3 poems in Grail, I've also published in a pamphlet called 3 Spells for a Blue Moon, because they were all written on the night of the blue moon. And these were written under a reasonable, strong dose of psychedelics. And I'd asked the goose, my spirit guide, to give me a spell to enter into the Glastonbury mythos. And she gave me 3, in fact, that night. And this is the 3rd. Dodd cut the cards. Dodd Lane, some of you who have been to Glastonbury will have heard of. And there's a famous Dodd line John Michel identified, a dragon line that flows very close to where I live. And John Michel thought Dodd was maybe connected with Thoth or Toth, the Egyptian god of divination, including the tarot. So this is in the form of a tarot reading. And it's intended as a healing as well, a healing spell. Dodd cut the cards. Dodd cut the cards for the Avalon reading, the holy fool walking on air. Above him, the mage who lives up the lane, calling from Dodd knows where. Below him, the priestess opens the ways to the nurturing darkness within, and the light that shines on when we are gone, as it shines before we begin. Then the deck gets stacked, the message gets scrambled, the hanged man strung up on the tor, and all fall down save only the tower and plague, the devil and war. Dodd, shuffle the pack, give strength in the woman to temper the lion's lust, the star to mingle the blood and white streams, and the moon to dream us as the playful children we once were and shall become, shining, laughing, dancing in the gardens of the sun.
We have Mark just in, and if you're ready to read for us, Mark, that would be amazing. Do we still have Mark? Yes.
We do indeed. I'm so sorry I'm late. I had a pastoral thing that I had to attend to last minute. Actually, it's psychedelic related one, so I had to practice what I preach and prioritize that. But I'm so happy to be here with you guys now, and so happy to hear Kaya Sidney, John. If people are inspired to get Grail, there's so many more gems in there. I don't know if I told you, John, but the Ballad of Grope Cunt Lane is probably my favourite. Yeah. Do you want a spiel from me, or do you want me to just kind of go ahead and maybe talk about the poem specifically and then read the poem? Or
Mark. There are no rules here.
Okay, yeah, John's my middle name actually, but in Estonian.
Really?
Yeah, Juhan. Anyway, so a bit like John, I'm also inspired by history. This is a large muse for me, and yeah, in general, when it comes to like writing poems, creating a ground in which they can arrive to you seems to be probably my like top tip. So I know John will probably agree in his time in a theatre troupe, but one thing that really helps me is actually committing poems to memory, because in that way the everyday world comes to seem more poetic, especially the poems which you don't get or affect you on a deeply emotional level, but you can't quite understand why. But this poem, Sylphium, basically came out of a Wikipedia rampage when I discovered that there was an aphrodisiac birth control that humans had plucked to extinction, which I just thought dribbled poetry. And when I realized that it wasn't just an aphrodisiac and a birth control, and a kind of perhaps lesson for our times as one of the first plants to fall prey to the Anthropocene, as we now call it. It was also used as a perfume, but also to heal wounded anuses. It was used in loads of different contrasting ways. Fresh roots were dipped in vinegar. It was a delicacy in ancient Rome. But it was also worth its weight in gold because it became so valuable. It was even printed on Greek coinage. And what's strange, the reason the plant was so rare was because it was probably a unique form of hybrid that only formed in one particular part of the world, such that its seeds didn't actually produce it. And so when the king, when people tried to export it from the kingdom of Cyrene, which is the reason that Cyrene became the richest kingdom in Africa for a while, they couldn't. Because its seeds wouldn't actually produce it, but also because it probably required the unique kind of rhizosphere or microbiome of that North African soil. So I decided to write a kind of ode to it, which I haven't quite decided on the title. As you can see, it's got kind of 4 working titles.
Oh, I thought that was the title. I thought that was the title.
Well, that might even remain indeed the title. So either the Sylphium Epitaph, because when I set it to music, I set it partly to the tune of the oldest full extant song called the Psychedelic Epitaph in human written history. An epitaph is, of course, what we have on our gravestone, and there have been some great ones. So either the Sylphium Epitaph or On Extinct Panacea, or duty-free Sylphium, after the notion of kind of duty-free in airports, but also it kind of having relinquishing people in the Roman Empire from the duties associated with the sexual act, like procreation. And so, yeah, I mean, yeah, it was that's the kind of preamble to this. So I don't think any topic is like too small for poetry, and even a Wikipedia rampage can lead to one. So yeah, shall I just go right ahead then? Okay. There's a plant the Romans shan't ever re-see nor we recede. They loved it to extinction new, and its main use was very loose. To change the rhythm, just to be with them, we set the stage for each foul age in which the human thinks all is for 'em, and so risks all for pleasures small. Silphium, oh Silphium, you heart-shaped, money-stamped, living lamb flesh, tendering, birth-controlling, aphrodisiac. You slanderously perfuming, pulse-preserving, impulse-serving, fresh-root, vinegar-dipped delicacy. You dog-bite healing, anus-calming, I'm way less starving, Libyan miracle. You're worth your weight in gold. Too late, the earth's outsold to Cyrene's richest bidder. Unbidden, you're a fussy plant for pussy cunts, cocks and dicks. Rocked it, but tit, what wit? Stinking great, extinction early. Inkling late, what tincture rarely does all your pinch. Oh, growing poem. Your last left was Emperor's right first. You're uncultivatable, all over the table, presaged, postaged, foraged, ravaged, love-aged, rummaged. From whorehouse to kitchen to butcher to ouch. From coffer to coffee to lover to over. From ecology to economy, from rules to black market. Unfarmable, fun farmer costs. Big farmer, no farmer. For either, your seed's needs are North African chemistry, not the uncoiled soils of our unyielding fields, or rather, plants merged uniquely for one generation, obliquely, in one location, untweakably. Dear Panacea, we play with your fire, but has all been earned and burned, or haven't we learnt from the one-off pinpricks of history's unlivable mysteries, patterned again and fattened by pen? For, though your seeds do not bear you, and you're long, long gone, you're here all along. With you, we all belong. To you, our want is one.
So wonderful, and actually quite different to what we've had so far. I'm kind of conscious of time and was just going to say, let's just open it up, and any questions that anyone has to anybody, go wild.
Would you say that your relationship, John, with place and poetry has changed in the transition between being in Southwark and conducting the rituals and then going to Glastonbury and writing Grail? I think one of the things I was really struck by that I loved in the introduction of Grail is this idea of the mythologies of the place and kind of the blood and the tears going into the ground and coming up as the flowers and the streams. And in a way that almost kind of seems to me to be the opposite of kind of constructing from scratch the psychic architecture of a place on the astrals so that it then percolates into being physical, but is kind of much more a communion with what's already there in the physical. So yeah, I guess I'm curious about your relationship with story and place and the things around you and how that changed in Glastonbury.
Thanks, Ros. Yeah, I mean, the Southwark Mysteries, I'm sure I'd worked with place before, but it was the most monumental sense of immersion. You know, it was because it was the place I lived. Everywhere I write about in the Southwark Mysteries was within 5 or 10 minutes walk of my place. You know, Crossbones was only 5 minutes from where I lived. The whole way I came across it and everything in the middle of a vision, and was told about what it was in a poem, and then discovering that actually in some way I'd tapped into something, some unconscious energy, really. And so that was very affirmative, and it changed the whole direction of my poetry. I mean, up to then as a writer, I think I'd sought to impress in some way myself or the world by being as good a writer as I could. And suddenly, in a strange way, that wasn't the issue, because it had its voice. And this, for me, is once I'd known that, it's like I couldn't go back to the kind of writer I was before, because it was that a voice that seemed to totally interact with the place I was in and with others. I often say, you know, before I took the trip, and on the 23rd November 1996, I'd spent months walking around the area, around the back streets, and I see that as equally important, the walking. It's it's a way of connecting with places, I think, out of the sort of corner of your eye or out of the back of your mind, rather than simply researching, which I also obviously did a lot. So yeah, but you're right, within all that, the Southwark Mysteries did create a kind of mythic history of Southwark, which I think in the early days of Crossbones, a lot of people took very literally. And then later, Transport for London and people actually got experts to try and prove that I couldn't prove it was the single women's churchyard, which I can't. It was a mythic idea, I mean, that happened to connect randomly with a whole lot of folklore and history that was out there already. But as you say, there was a sense in creating a whole world or remapping a world, whereas Glastonbury is already very mapped psychically. And in a way, the interesting thing about Glastonbury is you can see how it's a whole countless superimpositions, really. So you have, even in the people who are drawn here, some are drawn to this really ancient Tor, earth, even pre-Druidic energy. Some are drawn more to the whole Christian heritage of the Abbey. Many are drawn by religions that had no connection with Glastonbury until 50 years ago. And all these things kind of superimpose. And I find that fascinating as a poet. I mean, it can be overwhelming. And I think if as a poet you completely sort of immerse yourself in just singing the 1,000 names of God, you can get... It can make it in some way inaccessible. I think I'm always trying in a poem to invite people in. And so when I moved to Glastonbury, I would use that metaphor, although it's more than a metaphor really, of introducing the goose to the native spirits. And because in a way I know how I work with the goose, I couldn't totally explain it, but instinctively I know exactly how it works. And so it became a really interesting way of interfacing with the Arthur and Merlin legends, Joseph of Arimathea, the more ancient pagan things. And I think I spoke earlier about the Liberty, the goose, you know, her name is Liberty. That's the other name of the goose. And liberty in this sense is this idea of a really free psychic space in which we don't have to bind ourselves to this either or dualism constantly. To me, that's one of the most important things in this. And so in Glastonbury, I found working with the goose, in some sense, it meant allowing both the most pagan and dark gods into this mind map, as well as elevating Our Lady and the Christian saints. And for me, that's quite a natural thing. And I feel, in a way, in Glastonbury, it was a kind of my little calling, because there is also in Glastonbury historically and recently a lot of tension between Christians and pagans. It's interesting that historically there wasn't really. They got on pretty well and kind of intermingled and co-influenced one another. But in the last 50 years, I think people have become much more polarized, or actually in the last 10 years, as people have really become polarized back into old belief systems. It's extraordinary in a way where in my lifetime I'd seen the emergence from that and people becoming free from that. It's very strange to see the temptation to retreat into a position of certainty and then shout at the rest of the world, you fools, you're all doomed.
Yeah, I agree. We've certainly become more polarized. I also just wanted to use this as an opportunity to say thank you again for your work at Crossbones. It's sort of my default meeting place in London, if it's even slightly convenient. And in material terms, it's a decorated railing, if you don't know what it but this combination of like material and myth sets up the day in a very particular way. It's, it liberates. I just wanted to say thank you. And there's always someone else there doing something really, really out of the ordinary.
Yeah, the look of recognition when you go, when it's not the 23rd of the month, and you've just found a reason why you're choosing that as the locus. There's always someone there, and there's always this kind of, yes, we're at Crossbones look, and it's very, very special.
I think so, and it's a joy to hear that, Reanne. Thank you for all your work, but thank you for saying that. It is very important, and it gives me incredible joy. Only a couple of days ago, somebody has sent me, they'd handmade their sort of book that they're hoping to turn into a tarot pack, and it's a kind of sex workers tarot and book, and it was beautiful, and it's a total labor of love. And the woman who sent it me, she's handmade it, and it's her own poems with meditations on various sex workers through history and talking about the law and relating. I was very honored because her card number 5 in the major arcana was which is the Pope or the psychopomp she had as Crow, but with a piece on the Winchester geese. And that's a joy to me. I mean, at Crossbones, the strongest message I put out was the goose is loose. And I've been really delighted to see that people have run with her or flown with her in their own ways, because that is the intention. I'm not like, I was probably in the early days very territorial with her, if a bloke looked at my goose on the astral. But I've chilled out. She's for everyone.
That line, my aim is to astonish you, just gets me every time. It just
gets me. The night I wrote that, Reanne, that was probably just about 1 a.m. And, I was on this really bonkers strong trip, as you know. And when I wrote those lines, I really did genuinely got the shivers, because I thought, what, mate? What have you got here? So, yeah, thank you. I'm glad it gets you too. That makes me feel less alone.
Do we have time to maybe just ask everyone who read today and anyone else who wants to about your actual writing process and kind of what's going on with the pens and paper and cognitively as the words come out? Because I feel like we all go about it in very different ways. And I was really interested in what you said, John, about the importance of walking. And because I feel like when I'm writing a poem, I'll either go into this kind of trance and it will pour out of the pen, or it will be something that kind of is on the tip of my brain for days, and I'll walk around, and every so often I'll furtively get out my notebook again and another bit will come and it will all come together. But it can be very different depending on what the poem is and the nature of it and why you're writing it and what emotions are bubbling up, or whether it's that you're in the process of transcending emotions or that you're trying to. I feel like my writing changes, or writing practice changes every time. And something I've been thinking about recently in the idea of poetry as therapy, I was listening to a really great trauma therapist on a podcast who also uses poetry in her practice, called Ayala Amity, and she was talking about how often with trauma the idea is that you have this kind of fragmented narrative that you're desperately trying to put together, and poetry can be a means of like playing with that. So ever since realizing that, I've been kind of trying to focus more on what goes on in the process of the poem, rather than when you've got the poem at the end, having it as this internal incantation, because very often previously in life that's kind of trapped me in the psychic architecture of that time. And I've got a particular poem that begins, "A memory bottled in imaginary absence, green fairies dance out of its absence." And I feel like I remained kind of bottled in the time of that memory by returning to it for a very, very long time before I metaphorically smashed the bottle. And the one that I'm trying to write at the moment, I don't know if it will work to try and write it online with you guys, but essentially, if I show you a bit of the plan of it, then it is about being the hanged man in tarot, hung up on a scaffold, and through the poem he transmutes into the mage, and then you get this agility with language as he breaks out of the entrapment at the beginning. So it's going to start as a sonnet, and it's going to have this very restrictive rhyme scheme, and then halfway through it's going to break as the transformation occurs, and there's going to be this psychic shift that also comes with looser language and freedom and facility. And one thing that I'm excited to do with it particularly is to play with the reading experience. So I had this idea on ketamine, but it will essentially refer back to earlier parts of the poem and say, while you think we're down here doing this, I'm actually up on a decorator's ladder tinkering with the apostrophes in the first line. And it will hopefully just really turn the scaffold into a climbing frame as the mage becomes the mage rather than the hanged man. But so I just basically have this page of my notebook that I return to, where I kind of treat it a bit like a cryptic crossword as I try to bring it into being. But yeah, I'm very, very curious about all of your processes behind the poems that we heard today, and how writing works for you guys.
I really love that that concept of having these kind of little references to the process, but in these kind of playful ways, like, being a sort of painter and decorator up in a different part of the poem. That sort of that definitely gives me little tingles. I can see that being a great thing to encounter. The one that I read today, actually, I think actually serves quite well as a example of how this tends to work for me, in that I definitely, if it's going to be a good one, I tend to have some kind of a I don't quite even know where it's coming from, just pours out of me kind of moment with writing poems. But what I've learned to be able to do over the years is to be able to then go back and move things around, add things, take things out, and to do that over a whole period of time. And sometimes they need it, sometimes they really don't. Sometimes they just arrive kind of completely fully formed, and I'll return to it several times and just think, no, it's perfect as it is. Maybe a comma there, whatever. But with this one, actually, the first half is pretty much like that, and the second half I actually only finished as I was sending it to Reanne yesterday. I've been working on it for months, and up until today, I still may have more work to do on it. Up until today, I've pretty much just read the first half of that whenever I've read it, but I've always felt that isn't quite complete, and that it does need that kind of second half to kind of be the reflection of the first half in a certain way, to sort of say some of the same things but through a different prism. So yeah, that's been much more coming back, moving things around, taking things out, adding things in, and still not sure if that's all done.
I love that though, as a space for both, like talking about the capacity to encapsulate a paradox. If you've got these different styles working or jarring, or whether they're sort of in harmony or not, that's liberating. John, you've got me saying liberating.
Well, it's the big game, isn't it?
Yeah. That's the mission, I think. Certainly mine. I've kind of here, I should probably maybe not do this, but I was just so kind of taken with all the conversation about place as well, and about invoked otherworldly place, and the influence that can have on physical space, and on the kind of, I think what really interests me is particularly through the kind of embodiment work that I've been doing in recent years, but is this kind of notion that the other world and this world are in some sense the same world, and that it's just about how one's perceiving it in that moment. And I find poetry a really interesting place for exploring those boundaries and those non-boundaries. I'll leave it there.
Mark, do you want to finish us off?
Yeah, I feel like there are kind of two questions when it comes to writing. Basically, that's the question of like reception and the question of production. And for me, what I've realized over the years is the more actively we can receive, the more passively like production happens, or the more easily maybe. So yeah, there will be times, like we've all mentioned, when the poem just seems to come out as if from another place, in a kind of what feels like channeling, and maybe what is indeed channeling. And yet at other times there are kind of little conundrums or riddles that you might be working in your notepad on for days, weeks, or months. And then eventually it kind of crystallizes into a form you're happy with. But for me, there are basically two ways I kind of try and cultivate a ground from which that can happen. And it's the same with music, I think. And one of them is is perhaps a rather boring one, and that's actually to learn things by rote, which is actually incredibly useful, more useful than we think. Especially the poems that hover on the fringes of understanding and yet affect us emotionally very deeply.
You almost said interstices then, didn't you?
Yeah, I did almost say interstices.
I know.
Interstices between understanding. And the other thing for me is spontaneous prayer, actually, which seems to create a space of where you're kind of real talking the universe, I guess. And what you'll find then is that everyday reception of not just artistic and cultural things like poems and films and visual art, but even like walking through a town, like John mentioned, can become a lot more intrinsically poetic. But it does require like cultivation and effort sometimes. It's not always like a passive conduiting of something beyond. It can and has become that at points, but often it's actually quite the quotidian and the everyday and the banal come into it as well in terms of cultivating the ground.
Can I ask you a quick question while I've got you there, Mark?
Go ahead.
What is a prayer? I've never thought about it before. It just occurred to me as I was talking, but I don't really know what a prayer is.
Loads of ways to look at it. Like, well, meditation is the more passive, prayer is the more active component of one thing. But what is a prayer? For me, it's a mixture of kind of gratitude and promise, I guess, and hope. Gratitude, promise, and hope. And yeah, so the way I pray, I tend to pray for unknown others and known others. Gratitude, intention or promise, and then hope. So that's the kind of broad structure of my prayer life when it goes well.
And that's a different process to writing poetry. That's if you write.
It is, but what you'll find is that things come out in that, because it's good to vocalize, to use your vocal cords when you pray, not just keep it in your head. Things come out in incredibly poetic ways especially when you're praying for friends who need help, and you realize there's this one thing that might help them, and you work through those problems. Because as we said, poetry can be incredibly therapeutic for emotional riddles that we're trying to come to terms with or figure out coping strategies for. But so you when you pray, the more you practice it, the more you realize how incredibly freeing it is. It's this kind of stream of consciousness, very much akin to poetry. So I think it's cultivating the same thing, and I think the best prayers are poetic. It's cultivating that stream of consciousness, that stream of being, of speaking your deepest aspirations and desires into a place where it's not going to be where nothing is too ridiculous, basically.
Thank you. That's a really wonderful definition. Any last words before we depart for the evening?
I just saw your message, whether you wanted to end with here lay your hearts.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
We can join in. Mark knows it well. Some of you know it very well. Crossbones Gates, it always echoes because people repeat when they hear the line. So on Zoom, it's just heroic. Should we just say it once? What do you think, Mark? Or 3 times, 5 times? What do you want? 5. Let's go for it. Here lay your hearts.
Lay your hearts.
Flowers, your book flowers, your fingers, your thumbs. You'll miss you, mums.
You'll miss you, mums.
Yeah,
your hopes,
your dreams,
your might have been,
your locks,
your keys, your mysteries.
Here lay your hearts,
Here lay
your book of hours, your fingers, your thumbs, your miss you, mums. Here hang your hopes, your dreams, your might have been, your locks, your keys, your mysteries. Here lay your hearts, your flowers, your book of hours, your fingers, your thumbs, your miss you, mums. Here hang your hopes, your dreams, your might have been, your locks, your keys, your mystery. Here lay your hearts, your flowers, book of hours, your fingers, your thumbs, your miss you, mums. Here hang your hopes, your dreams, your might have been, your locks, your keys, your mysteries. Here lay your hearts, your flowers, your book of hours, your fingers, your thumbs, your miss you, mums. Here hang your hopes, your dreams, your might have been, your locks, your keys, your mysteries. Thank you all. Thank you, Reanne.
Thank you.
Buzz.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you all. Lovely to be with you.
Thank you, everyone.
Let's be in touch soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, poets, everyone.
Thank you so much, all.